I am Daniel Lucas, and welcome to Book 101 Review. And today we're having a Safa Sunday. Of course, the loving Miss Safa Burnell.
Hello, everybody. I hope you're having a fantastic day today, wherever you are in the world, whatever day or night you are listening to this. I hope you are having a wholesome, wonderful, and fantastic time and diving into some pretty darn good books.
Yes, good books, people. And thank you that Miss Burnell's giving us a lot of information about books. So, in celebration of Poetry Month, this is the last Sunday of April. Imagine Miss Burnell is so fast.
I'm gutted, but it's also giving me enough to gumption to get forward for next year. So I love poetry. I
Yes,
just do.
poetry, people.
Yeah.
And in continuation for our discussion about poetry, Miss Burnell and I will read some of her favorite poem.
I've got three
Oh,
books to go into today. One of them
yes.
is my own. I know that's facetious to say. Oh yeah, she's going to her favorite poetry, her own. But I have some beautiful books here. Warning Light Calling by a Danish poet, Peter Graham
Mhm.
Vestergaard. He writes in Danish and in English, and this is one of his English language works, Warning Light Calling. It is a fabulous, almost cyberpunky kind of poetry collection. It's fantastic. And then this is The Drake Equation by actually Dr. Brad Hogue, who is a science educator and incredibly learned man. And he uses kind of this sort of science fiction. The Drake Equation is about how many alien kind of presences there could be in the universe given the amount of planets who have certain kinds of atmosphere and that kind of thing. And so he goes into a lot of really interesting scientific sorts of poems in The Drake Equation. I am really also quite happy that they are both poets who were published by the House of Hallows, formerly known as Verita Literary. And so we all are a sort of cohort of 3 right now of people published by the same publisher. So full disclosure there. If you're like, hey, wait a minute. Yeah, they are they are my cohorts in the small press. So I'm very excited to be able to be like, hey, look at these guys. They're so awesome. So
Yes,
and if we get
they're
bored, there's
awesome.
always John Keats' Ode to Hyperion, because that one is my favorite poem of all time.
Yes. So, Miss Burnell, what are the difference between sonnet and villanelle in writing poem?
Well, they're different. They're different forms. So
Yes,
sonnets. Now, what kind of sonnet are we talking about?
in general.
So there's an Elizabethan sonnet, and there's more of an Italian form of sonnet. A sonnet is a 14-line poem. It has a specific rhythm. So in the kind of, if you look at like a Shakespearean sonnet, an Elizabethan sonnet, you're looking at something that's about 14 lines long, that's iambic pentameter. So da 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 da. Da, 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 da. And so it's got this rhythm that you're matching all of the stresses and the relaxes of each word into. And so that adds the complexity of it there. When it comes to form, you also usually have, in the Shakespearean sonnet, you have 3 stanzas and then a couplet at the end. It's a little bit different in the Petrarchan sonnet, which is like the Italian sonnet. But it's this very formal and elegant and often elevated kind of poem. Again, you think of a sonnet, you think of Shakespeare. You know, um, let's look one up.
Yes. Can we read some of the
Shakespeare's.
sonnet that you like?
Let's do it.
Yes.
All right. Okay. I love. Ooh. Okay. Da-da-da-da, for shame. Okay, sonnet number 10. For shame deny that thou bear'st love to any, who for thyself art so unprovident. Grant, if thou wilt, thou art beloved of many, but that thou none lovest is most evident. Okay, so we're talking here that there's this person who is loved by many, but clearly doesn't love anybody. For thou art so possessed with murderous hate that against thyself thou stickst not to conspire, seeking that beauteous roof to ruminate, which to repair should be thy chief desire. Basically, again, this person is so kind of filled with negative emotions, with hatred and things like that, that they've stuck themselves on top of this sort of plinth of their own, this sort of roof of their own, when really they should be repairing the damage that they've done. Oh, change thy thought that I may change my mind. Shall hate be fairer lodged than gentle love? Be as thy presence is, gracious and kind, or to thyself at least kind-hearted prove. Make thee another self for love of me, that beauty may still live in thine or thee. So basically at the end of that, we have the last stanza where, oh, change thy thought that I may change my mind. Like, I don't want to hate you. Change the way that you look at things so that I don't have to hate you anymore, that other people don't have to hate you anymore, or change that, or to thyself at least kind-hearted prove, or to thyself at least kind-hearted prove is, or at least love yourself. At least
Love
love
yourself.
you. Like, you know. And then you have the final couplet, make thee another self for love of me, that beauty may still live in thine or thee. So, kind of change yourself a little bit, like, okay, you're clearly, sometimes they say, oh no, you have to take people where they're at. I mean, I believe you, but if someone's truly doing things like we see in this poem where that person is being quite hateful and they're being quite negative, you know what? It's okay to say, maybe you better check yourself. You better check yourself. Maybe you need to kind of take a look there and see what you can do to improve yourself. Improve yourself and then improve how you are seen by others by doing good things, by kind of, modifying and adjusting behavior. And I think this is one of the things that I love about Shakespearean sonnets. It's so human. Yes, the language is different. We don't say these and thous and for thou art so possessed. That 'gainst thyself thou stickst not to conspire, seeking that beauteous roof to ruminate. Like, we don't speak like that anymore. But the
Yes.
sentiments behind it are still relevant and absolutely human. And, even though language changes, humanity doesn't necessarily change as much as we think.
Yes. And those are legacy that we need to go back and praise because it's something else. So, Miss Bernal, before we go on, I want to shout out our listeners from India. Thank you, India, for supporting this podcast where I'm going to just share it my screen. Okay, just give me a minute because we have a lot of listeners in India, Miss Bernal. And I want to shout out them because in Maharashtra, I got 14%, Karnataka, Telangana, National Capital Territory, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, West Bengal, Daman and Du, Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, Haryana, Gujarat, and a lot more. India is a big, big country. So thank you, India, for supporting this podcast. Namaste, namaste because this podcast is created to empower, of course, Miss Safa Bernels and a lot of writers and authors all over the world. And thank you, Spotify, for being number one on the top platforms listening. And of course, Apple Podcasts, web browser, and Amazon Music, and others. Thank you so much. So, Miss Bernal, can you read one of your favorite poem in your book?
In my book. Okay. Let's do. All
Please do
right.
visit Miss Safa Bernal website. It's something else. I want to do this too.
All right. Here we go. I am going to read Cosmogenic Choreography, which is one of the poems in Usurper Kings. It kind of helps close off the first act. And what I did with Usurper Kings is I did 5 acts. I went, this is going to be about the feminine through time, and from hunter-gatherer kind of all the way up to, the future when we've all uploaded into some form of cloud and no longer have bodies. And then what happens with that, what happens with somebody's mind. And this one, it was something that I wrote basically when I was going through, troubles with my knee. I ended up having knee surgery. I completely obliterated my left knee in martial arts. I make the joke, you should see the other guy, but I was the one that needed surgery after. So it's definitely me trying to get out just this idea of needing to go through surgery and needing to have reconstruction done and different things like that, and how that would change my life. And at the time I was still writing this book, I was trying to figure it all out and figure out that sort of healing process. And so me being me, I couldn't just do that by figuring out my own stuff. I had to look at various world mythologies and do my best as a way, as an homage, a loving homage to certain mythologies and certain religions that are still practiced today. So, cosmogenic choreography, dance. Dance, Shiva with a game leg, stumble upon Mahayuga between recuperation and cyclic genesis. Tear it down, damaged ragged tissue, knee with loose strings, tear it down. Atomize fallow bits gathered in Paleolithic lean-tos, create feminine huts and long-standing burrows collecting rainwater every 28 moons. We teethed on your ankles, broke anklets of seed cords, buried them alongside ancestors who became entropy. Stumble, Lord Destroyer, into vague mythic mathematics, pardon me. Dance to the crackle of planetary radiation, the pockmarked chords of human cries decimating your shattered bones. Be born in Shakti's adoring pastoral embrace. I love how by reading that poem, I absolutely said Mahayuga, but couldn't somehow pronounce mathematics. This explains my report cards growing up so much. But yeah, so that one's a little bit of a shorter one. But I was really going into, too, I was doing a lot of research on sort of burial practices in kind of prehistory and things, and what people actually figured out when, you have this sort of kind of difference between people who buried the dead and people who cremated the dead. And so what was it about this sort of agricultural society that was kind of on the fringes, and then you have a sort of connections between multiple other things, and that question of when a person becomes entropy, when they just become a force of sort of chaos, and what's more chaotic than that? So
Yes. So, Miss Bernal, how can alteration or assonance be used effectively in poetry?
I think, well, first, I think you need to kind of look at, again, what kind of poetry that you are, doing. I think something like alliteration, in skaldic poetry, the oral poetry tradition of, pre-medieval and medieval Scandinavia, alliteration is everywhere. It's absolutely everywhere in the form in skaldic poetry. A lot of internal rhyme, a lot of alliteration. You get a lot of the sagas, you have, Beowulf going even into like kind of Old English, Old Norse, and, these kennings and things like that are using these skipping alliterations to sort of bring in a sense of rhythm and a sense of meaning, especially when this is being read aloud. This is something being performed, not necessarily read. I mean, now we read it aloud, but then they would have just performed it. It would have just been remembered and performed. It would not. And that's one of the problems that we have with a lot of like skaldic poetry and a lot of poetry in a lot of places. It's, there was no written form necessarily. It was just what people remembered. I remember watching a video of one of the last people who could perform the entire Kalevala, which is a Finnish origin. And it was this ancient old man, and there was nobody else that really remembered the whole thing like he did. And so they were trying to record his voice and record the way that he performed it so that it didn't get lost in that kind of cultural sway. So I think that the repetition of that consonant sound, or even a vowel sound, like that repetition of sound in something, it loses something when it's just written down. You do need to say it out loud. You do need to kind of enjoy it as a vocal, a sonic thing. And then it can kind of be like skipping stones to get you into the rhythm of something, to get you into the meaning of a poem, by using this sort of clever, consistent, cacophony of, created noises. But it's something that if it's done poorly, people are going to be like, oh, wow, Sally sells seashells, huh? And like, okay, yeah, we get it. It's like, oh, dear. You could do it so poorly. You need to make sure you do it well. I think with assonance, that's more of like the vowel version of alliteration a little bit. But it adds a sense of musicality to it. I definitely think it adds a sense of flow. I remember when Kes and I were writing some music for a project that's going to be coming out in the next year. We were writing some lyrics. Kes was writing lyrics and things like that. And as a vocalist myself, as a singer, I was, performing them, and we were kind of doing a dry run and going, hold on here, and basically the way that I've watched Cass grow in writing lyrics for things was by listening to myself and Emily attempt to sing them. And then understanding that, okay, certain vowel sounds, certain consonant sounds right smack next to each other, even though the words look great on the page, if you don't voice them, you don't know how potentially difficult that is for a singer or somebody to perform. And you get those tongue twisters that twist the tongue, and you're like, oh, all of a sudden you know that a theater kid is getting into tongue twisters because all of a sudden their posture gets a little better, and then their mouths go wider, and then they're like, okay, here we go. I'm going to say Sally sells seashells on the seashore, and you're going to be doing these tongue twisters kind of thing. I think they create that musicality, they create that overall sound and rhythm, but it's just another one of those moments where you realize poetry is meant to be heard, not just read. And that goes back thousands of years.
True.
That's one of the origins of poetry in the first place. So,
So Miss Bernal, can you recite one of those famous poems that you want to share to us?
Oh, I will do some of Ode to Hyperion by Keats. This was my favorite poem when I was a kid. I mean, a teenager, the teens now are like, hey, yes, I still view teens as kids, and I did when I was a teen too. So sorry, not sorry. If that's the hot take you take, then at least read Hyperion by John Keats.
Definitely, yes.
But it's a quite lengthy poem, so I won't read the whole thing, but I will read the first few stanzas. Book 1. Deep in the shady sadness of a vale, far sunken from the healthy breath of morn, far from the fiery noon and eve's one star, sat grey-haired Saturn, quiet as a stone, still as the silence round his lair. Forest on forest hung about his head like cloud on cloud. No stir of air was there, not so much life as on a summer's day robs not one light seed from the feathered grass, but where the dead leaf fell, there did it rest. A stream went voiceless by, still deadened more by reason of his fallen divinity spreading a shade. The naiad mid her reeds pressed her cold finger closer to her lips. Along the margin sand large footmarks went, no further than to where his feet had strayed, and sleep there since. Upon the sodden ground his old right hand lay nerveless, listless, dead, unsceptered, and his realmless eyes were closed, while his bowed head seemed listening to the earth, his ancient mother, for some comfort yet. It seemed no force could wake him from his place, but there came one who with a kindred hand touched his wide shoulders, after bending low with reverence, though to one who knew it not. She was a goddess of the infant world. By her in stature the tall Amazon had stood a pygmy's height. She would have ta'en Achilles by the hair and bent his neck, or with a finger stayed Ixion's wheel. Her face was large as that of Memphian Sphinx, pedestaled happily in a palace court when sages looked to Egypt for their lore. But oh, how unlike marble was that face, how beautiful if sorrow had not made sorrow more beautiful than beauty's self. There was a listening fear in her regard, as if calamity had but begun, as if the vanward clouds of evil days had spent their malice, and the sudden rear was with in stored thunder laboring up. One hand she pressed upon that aching spot where beats the human heart, as if just there, though an immortal, she felt cruel pain. The other upon Saturn's bended neck she laid, and to the level of his ear, leaning with parted lips, some words she spake in solemn tenor and deep organ tone. Some mourning words which in our feeble tongue would come in these like accents. Oh, how frail to that large utterance of the early gods! Saturn, look up. The wherefore, poor old king? I have no comfort for thee, no, not one. I cannot say, oh, wherefore sleepest thou? For heaven is parted from thee, and the earth knows thee not, thus afflicted for a god, and oceans too, with all its solemn noise, has from thy sceptre passed, and all the air is emptied of thine hoary majesty. Thy thunder, conscious of the new command, rumbles reluctant o'er our fallen house, and thy sharp lightning in unpractised hands scorches and burns our once serene domain. O aching time, O moments big as years, as all ye pass swell out the monstrous truth, and press it so upon our weary griefs that unbelief has not a space to breathe. Saturn, sleep on. O thoughtless, why did I thus violate the sombre solitude? Why should I ope thy melancholy eyes? Saturn, sleep on, while at thy feet I weep. It continues on, and Saturn eventually wakes up. We learn more about the planets. We learn more about Thea, who is the woman speaking right in that section, and we eventually get to Hyperion, or as known as the Titan sphere, self-hid or prison-bound, groaned for the old allegiance once more, and listened in sharp pain for Saturn's voice, because Saturn was kind of the head of that. But one of his whole mammoth brood still kept his sovereignty and rule and majesty. Blazing Hyperion on his orbed fire still snuffed the incense teeming up from man to the sun's god, yet unsecure. For as among us mortals omens dread, fright and perplex, so also shuddered he, not at the dog's howl or gloom bird's hated screech, or the familiar visiting of one upon the first toll of his passing bell, or prophesying of the midnight lamp, but horrors portioned to a giant nerve oft made Hyperion ache. His palace bright bastioned with pyramids of glowing gold and touched with shades of bronzed obelisks, glared a blood red through all its 1,000 courts, arches, domes, and fiery galleries, and all its curtain of Aurorian clouds flushed angrily, while sometimes eagle's wings, unseen before by gods or wandering men, darkened the place. And it's just like, Keats had such a way of beautifying the mundane and beautifying the slightly horrific. I could go on, but I won't, because it's a really long poem. But Hyperion, we're starting off with this deep in the shady sadness of a vale, far sunken from the healthy breath of morn. So we're in this sort of silent, dark, forested area. It's overgrown. It's the kind of forest that nothing's happened to it in a long time. And when for myself, I was raised in Western Canada, close to the coast. And so when you go to certain forests, you can see, oh yeah, trees have fallen down, new trees have grown, and you can kind of get that sense of life in a forest. But if you go to some forests, nothing has happened to this place. There's been no, thankfully no fires. There's been no catastrophes. A whole bunch of trees are just kind of there, and it gets stagnant. And there's no longer that same sense of life that there is in forests, which are constantly kind of gone through. And so you've got this sort of hidden place. You've got this forgotten forest beyond a soundless stream. And there's Saturn. There is Saturn. And he's using the name Saturn. In mythology, there is that question of Well, who is Saturn? In Greek mythology as opposed to Roman mythology.
So, Miss Bernal, how do you choose the right voice or point of view for a poem?
Number one, I read it and see what motifs that they're actually making.
Yes.
I look and see, is this something where, the naiad is sort of happily through the forest, going along, la 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 la. And in that case, she was a goddess of the infant world by her statue, the tall Amazons had like all of a sudden you're a little bit more like da 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 da. You're kind of perched on the words because, this is, Thea kind of traipsing through the forest. But instead, when I see it's the shady sadness of a veil, it's far sunken, you've got that image of gray-haired Saturn, quiet as stone. And the second you have that, you have this sense of time. And the sense of time as this sort of stagnant thing in this place, this sort of beset and put upon. And so the second you kind of see those motifs in it, all of a sudden you're lowering your voice a little bit. You're lowering your voice. You are giving it a little bit more gravitas, as they say. And then I'm the kind of person, when I perform, I want to try and give different voices to different characters. I don't always succeed. Sometimes it's like, oh, why don't you just say it in your voice? That would be better. And it's like, okay, sorry about that. I'll try again. But
Next time.
just this, a little raising of the voice, from would come in these like accents. Oh, how frail to that large utterance of the early gods. Saturn, look up. It's just that little change of voice. And all of a sudden it's slightly different. It's not completely different, but it's slightly different from the rest of the stuff that we're talking about, because this is an actual conversation that Thea's attempting to have with Saturn. And then she realizes, wait a minute, maybe I should let him sleep because he's lost his throne. He's lost everything. Zeus is in command. And really that's what this poem is about. It's about Hyperion and how Hyperion was a Titan, but he didn't fall with the other Titans. He stayed basically as the sort of the sun deity for a long time until Helios and Apollo kind of took over later on. But I see what kind of things are being said, what the tone is. I look into some subtext if that is available. I take a good few read-throughs, and then I just sort of test it out. I throw down. I try out a few lines and see whether or not on playback I like it.
So, what techniques can be used to develop a consistent tone in poetry?
I think learning where your poems live on the scale of, this is something that happens in a lot of fantasy and video games, that sort of sense of something from grim dark all the way to noble bright. You get that sense of like, noble bright, everything's okay, everything's going to be fine, and we're going to, yay, unicorns, woohoo, everything's kind of happy pixie, woohoo. Meanwhile, on the other side, you've got grimdark, which is like the most depressing, the most horrific, the most kind of negative of all of those kinds of genres, where you get a lot of catharsis. So you need to know where your poetry is going to live. You need to know what kind of tone you're going for. What is the, I say this a lot, but what is the reason behind this poetry? What do you want your readers to feel? What do you want them to understand as they interact with it? Do you want them to see outside of their perspective into yours? What perspective is that? Are you attempting to make them feel something? Well, a lot of the times, especially, it seemed like lately, the things that a lot of readers are willing to feel is a more negative type of emotion, or something that's a little bit more about rocking their world and making them feel shakier on their foundations rather than building up something else. And that's just something that happens cyclically through time. And eventually that will get a little bit stale. People will be like, you know what, I'm tired of that. I want to go back to feeling happy again. I want to know that, the world is depressing enough. We see this a lot in poetry. We also see it a lot in movies and literature as a whole. And we're going to be talking about this in the next few weeks too. So make sure you stay tuned to Book 101 because we're going to be talking about some of the shifts going on in fantasy and how cozy fantasy and certain kinds of romantic fantasy are sort of coming up, where the more dramatic sort of Game of Thronesy kind of fantasy is sort of not leaving. It's just being pushed to the side a little bit because events in the world being as they are, people are sad and there's a lot of trauma and there's a lot of darkness in the world right now. And so when that happens, literature tends to try and cope by finding the opposite.
Yes.
And there's that twist and there's that kind of twist and bend. You know, if events like we see when events were really good and there was a lot of, you know, decent stuff going on in certain economies and things like that. And, you know, people were fairly healthy, wealthy, and wise. Not saying that everybody was wealthy, not saying that at all, but depending on where you were from, there might have been more of an economic boon. Well, then your fiction, your poetry is going to be a little bit more of whatever you're not getting, you know, in that societal moment. And that kind of coincides with this idea that poetry can, in a lot of ways, be a form of rebellion. You know, I write punk literature. I write literature that's meant to be rebellious against the orthodoxy of the time. And I see a lot of that in poetry because poetry, you can experiment and you can rebel in ways that you can't necessarily in fiction because you can't sustain it for 17,000 lines like John Keats sustains Hyperion. But I think first you need to discover what is it that you want to leave people with. As much as people will decide on their own what they discovered, you know, people are wonderful in that way. Our minds are wonderful things. There is still a way for poets to kind of go, you know what, I want to go through this valley, but take you to the other side into a beautiful meadow. I want to lead you through a period of catharsis into something beautiful. And there are other poets who are like, I want to lead you from this mountaintop into the valley and then leave you there. And you have to know what your intention is when you're going in to write those poems, because oftentimes what will happen in my experience as both an editor of poetry and as a poet myself, if you are not consciously aware of your tone, it will surprise you when people call it out. And usually when they call it out, it's going to be a little bit more self-revealing than you thought. It's going to be that subconscious that you thought you were leaving on the side, but you didn't. Those biases are there and they're in full presence of mind.
Very
Is
well
that what
said.
you wanted? Yeah.
Very well said, Miss Bernal.
Yeah.
But before we go on, please do grab a copy of my collection of my notebook, people. Notebooks, collection of notebooks, and collection of flowers. Available on Amazon. For paperback is only $6 and hardcover is $13. It's all about the flowers in British Columbia. These flowers, Miss
Oh,
Bernal, is
nice.
taken here in the beautiful British Columbia. So I'm be proud that those notebook cover are the flowers in the British Columbia. And
You're
we are
making me want to
saying
go to
that
Van Dusen
British
Gardens.
Columbia are beautiful place to be. So please do
Yeah.
grab a copy. A collection of my notebooks. It's only $6 and for the paperback and $13 for hardcover. Available on Amazon. So, Miss Bernal, for the final word of poetry and the last week for Poetry Month, what is your advice for the aspiring writer that out there that want to write a poem?
Go outside. Stand up from your desk. Get away from your computer. Go to an art gallery. Go to a coffee shop you've never been in before. Go for a walk in nature. Go for a walk by the river. Go see people you haven't seen in a while. Go have conversations with family that you have been less than connected to, but could still benefit from learning from. Get away from the keyboard. Get away from the pen. put down your wonderful, beautiful notebook. Put it in your bag, though, to take it with you so that you got that flower notebook as inspiration for being able to write when you do sit down. And go experience life. Go to, if you are somebody who is old enough to and will do so responsibly, go to a wine tasting. Go to a restaurant that serves a different kind of food that you're not necessarily used to, but want to start learning and understanding. Visit places of cultural significance around you. Live life. Visit places. One of the most important pieces of being a poet or being an author in the first place is having experiences to draw from. And you can't do that if you're spending every day of your life in the same small little box. I mean, I say that, and then people are like, "Oh, well, what about Dickinson?" I mean, there's always going to be, exceptions to the rule. I understand that, but but yeah, what about the hermits? What about hermits? What about yes, okay, yeah, there are some pretty amazing Orthodox hermits and monks who have written some amazing things, but experience life, read things that you wouldn't normally read, nonfiction, read fiction, experience as much of the life around you as possible. And, travel's not necessarily in the budgets of everybody, but what's around you? What's around you you've never experienced? What's around you you've never done? There is a wealth of things in this world that we need to see, and then once you've had those experiences, you go out there and you do things you're not used to doing. Sit down in either a coffee shop or in a public plaza. Like around here we've got some public plazas that are actually quite beautiful just to sit in for a while, or sit down somewhere with a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or a drink of some kind and make notes of images that meant something, that struck you, even like in something mundane, the way a piece of paper just fluttered around the street in the wind. Whatever it is, write those images down. Write down what they kind of connected in your mind. And then you could start writing poetry.
Very well said, Miss Bernal. And please do grab a copy or buy my flowery book. Flowery
really nice.
notebook, people. And jot down
They're
your
good.
poem. So, Miss Bernal, thank you so much. And please do promote your books and books and your podcast.
This is the one for poetry. This is Usurper Kings. It was my first release back in 2014. It's been 10 years, and this is the 10th anniversary of this beautiful, beautiful poetry collection, if I do say so myself. And it actually, the 10th anniversary edition includes one extra poem and a new foreword about my journey 10 years later. So it's definitely one to pick up. You can pick it up in paperback and digital. You can see my website at saphaburnell.com. It's right on the screen right now if you're watching this on YouTube.
Yes.
And I had a lot of fun with that. I also grab these books. La la la. Okay. These are some more of my books I would love for you to read. I've got the Myth Punk Judge of Mystics saga with Charandash and Son of Abel. And Ginnungagap is coming out this year.
Yes.
I've also got something for the more horror-oriented people. Or actually, I was having a conversation with somebody who's like, yeah, well, I read things like, the Crawdads, and I read things, like more dark and slightly scary, but, really sort of like human condition. I was like, okay, I have the story for you. It's called Whiskey and Sinner's Blood. It is a novella in Macabre and Monstrous, which is a anthology that myself, Emily, and Kes put together. And it is a mother in 1990s Ireland who finds out her husband has traded their son's soul to the fairy queen.
Oh.
And it descends into anti-heroic madness. Absolutely the kind of thing if you like thrillers or if you like something a little bit more, family but darker. And then I've got the big boy, the Gigantums. I've got my cyberpunk novel, Neon Leben. Emptiness at the Center is the sequel, will be coming out this year as well, at the very end of the year, I should say. And so those are my books. You can find out more information at saphaburnell.com or .ca. That is saphaburnell.com. And you can order books directly from the website if you want signed copies, but there's also links to everywhere my books are sold. And I would encourage you to absolutely go for a seller that can bring my books in that are as geographically close to you as possible. So that kind of, helps on shipping every once in a while.
Yes. People listening in India.
Yes.
We have a lot of people listening in India. People, thank you, India, for supporting this podcast. So, Miss Berna, please do visit my Food 101 merchandise available on Etsy and Shopify. Food 101 merchandise, people. And Miss Berna, thank you for your time.
And thank you for yours. I hope you have a fantastic day. And see you again, everybody.
Yes. Tune in next week. Miss Bernal and I, we talk about fantasy.
And the really interesting switch of what certain agents and publishers are looking for in fantasy that some people are surprised about, but some people are not. So if you want to find out what's the newest and brightest in fantasy and what the next wave is going to be in fantasy literature, come take a listen next week.
Yes. So, Miss Bernal, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Morning, people. See you soon.